One man, 5 tanks, 6 rockets, and a choice that would either save his brothers or kill him in the next 60 seconds. December 15, 1944. A dirt road carved through the Philippine jungle. Private First Class Dirk J Vlug stands completely alone in the center of that road, his hands wrapped around a weapon designed for a 2-man crew, watching the trees shake as 5 Japanese Type 95 tanks grind toward his position. Behind him, wounded men who cannot run. Ahead of him, steel and fire and the mathematical certainty of his own death. He has 6 rockets. Standard military doctrine says you need backup, covering fire, coordination, retreat options. Dirk Vlug has none of these things. What he does have is a choice that will be made in the time it takes a tank shell to cross 30 yards of jungle air. And in that choice, in those next few minutes on a forgotten road most Americans could not find on a map, something will happen that defies every tactical manual, every survival instinct, every reasonable expectation of what one human being can do when the universe demands the impossible. The island of Leyte was never supposed to matter this much. It was a stepping stone, one more piece in the vast and bloody puzzle of the Pacific War, one more name that would be memorized by schoolchildren decades later, without understanding the price paid for every mile of its rain-soaked earth. But in December of 1944, Leyte had become the hinge upon which the entire Philippine campaign threatened to swing. General Douglas MacArthur had waded ashore 2 months earlier, fulfilling his famous promise to return, and the newsreels had captured that moment of triumph. With all the staged grandeur, the American public needed to believe the war was nearly won. The truth on the ground told a different story entirely. The Japanese understood what Leyte meant in ways that went beyond tactical calculation. Leyte was the gateway to Luzon, to Manila, to the heart of what remained of their crumbling empire in the Pacific. To lose Leyte was to lose the Philippines, and to lose the Philippines was to bring the war to the doorstep of the Japanese home islands themselves. And so they defended it with a desperation that transformed every ridge, every swamp, every narrow jungle trail into a killing ground where men fought with a ferocity born of absolute conviction. They had reinforced the island beyond all American expectations, pouring in troops through a continuous convoy operation that ran supplies and soldiers into Ormoc Bay on the western coast. The American advance, which should have been swift, had instead become a grinding, exhausting crawl through terrain that seemed designed by a malicious god specifically to torture infantrymen. The jungle itself was an enemy that required no orders and showed no mercy. Men who had fought across the islands of the Pacific thought they had seen everything the tropics could inflict upon the human body, but Leyte exceeded even the worst of their experiences. The rain fell in sheets that turned foxholes into drowning pools and roads into rivers of mud that swallowed vehicles to their axles. The heat was not the dry furnace heat of the desert, but a wet, suffocating blanket that turned every movement into an exhausting labor and rotted clothing off men's backs within days. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and fungal infections that ate through skin turned entire companies into hospitals without walls. And through all of this, the Japanese waited in positions they had prepared with meticulous care, willing to die in place rather than yield a single yard of ground they had sworn to hold. The 126th Infantry Regiment of the 32nd Infantry Division had been fighting on Leyte since the campaign began. They were not fresh troops filled with the aggressive confidence of men new to combat. They were exhausted veterans who had already learned the 1,000 small lessons that keep soldiers alive in the Pacific theater. Men who understood that glory was a word used by people who had never smelled what high explosives do to human bodies in confined spaces. They moved through the jungle with the cautious efficiency of workers performing a job they knew intimately and hated completely. Every man in the regiment had lost friends, had seen things that would revisit them in the darkness for the rest of their lives, and had made the internal adjustments necessary to continue functioning when function seemed impossible. Private First Class Dirk J. Vlug was one of these men, though nothing in his appearance or manner suggested he was preparing to do anything history would remember. He was 20 years old, born and raised in the flat farmland of Michigan, where winter came hard, and life was measured in practical increments of work completed and obligations met. He had joined the army because that was what young men did when their country went to war, not out of any particular ideology or thirst for adventure, but because it seemed like the obvious and necessary thing. He had trained with the bazooka because someone had to, and he had shown aptitude with the ungainly weapon that required you to balance a 4-foot tube on your shoulder, while someone else loaded a rocket from behind, and you tried to aim at targets that were usually shooting back at you with considerable enthusiasm. The bazooka was not a precision instrument. It was a shape-charge rocket launcher that could, under ideal conditions, penetrate the armor of a tank. Under non-ideal conditions, which described virtually every combat situation in which it was actually employed, it was a temperamental weapon that required its operator to get close enough to the target to smell the exhaust fumes, expose himself completely to enemy fire, and trust that the rocket would actually fly straight when he pulled the trigger. The effective range was listed in the manual as 300 yards. Combat veterans knew that anything beyond 100 yards was optimistic prayer rather than practical marksmanship. The weapon weighed 13 pounds unloaded, and each rocket added another 3.5 pounds to the load a soldier had to carry through terrain that made every ounce feel like a stone. Doctrine said that a bazooka team consisted of 2 men minimum, ideally 3, a gunner, a loader, and if you were fortunate enough to have the personnel, a 3rd man to carry extra ammunition and provide security. Doctrine said a lot of things that made perfect sense in training and fell apart the moment actual combat introduced its clarifying chaos into the equation. Doctrine did not account for casualties, for men wounded or killed, for squads that had been ground down to half strength by disease and attrition, for the moment when you suddenly find yourself the only person in a tactical position holding the only weapon capable of stopping what is coming toward you with the inevitability of a landslide. December 15th dawned like every other day on Leyte, which is to say it was miserable before the sun fully cleared the horizon. The roadblock on the Ormoc Road was a small affair, nothing that would have rated more than a brief mention in any after-action report. A few men, some hastily emplaced defensive positions, a strategic point that needed to be held because the road itself mattered more than the specific soldiers assigned to hold it. The Ormoc Road was the main supply artery for Japanese forces in the western sector of the island, and controlling it meant controlling the flow of reinforcements and materials that sustained their defensive positions. American forces had been pushing hard to cut this lifeline, and the Japanese had been pushing back with equal determination. The roadblock was a small piece in that larger struggle, manned by soldiers who understood their job was to delay, to hold, to make the enemy pay for every yard they tried to reclaim. Vlug was at the roadblock that morning with a partial squad, men he knew and trusted in the way soldiers learn to trust the people they have bled beside. They had set up their position with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this many times before, finding whatever cover the terrain offered, positioning their weapons to create interlocking fields of fire, making a mental map of fallback positions and escape routes in case the situation deteriorated beyond their ability to hold. They had ammunition, grenades, determination, and the knowledge that somewhere behind them were more American forces who were counting on this road staying in friendly hands. What they did not have was artillery support, armor of their own, or any illusion that their small position could withstand a determined Japanese assault if the enemy decided to commit serious resources to breaking through. The sound came first as a vibration through the earth, a low mechanical rumble that experienced soldiers recognized instantly as tank engines. Then the noise itself became audible, the distinctive clatter and grind of tracked vehicles moving through jungle terrain, breaking through the ambient sounds of insects and birds with mechanical intrusion that meant the nature of the situation had just changed fundamentally. Tanks were not common in the close terrain of the Philippine jungle. The Japanese had landed them, but the conditions that made infantry combat so difficult made armor operations nearly impossible. Roads were few, and off-road movement through the mud and vegetation was a recipe for vehicles becoming hopelessly bogged down. But on the roads themselves, in the rare places where tracked vehicles could actually maneuver, a tank represented overwhelming firepower against infantry positions that were never designed to resist armor. 5 Type 95 light tanks emerged from the jungle and onto the road with the confidence of predators that have just spotted vulnerable prey. The Type 95 was not an impressive machine by the standards of the Sherman tanks that formed the backbone of American armored forces, but impressive is a relative term that means nothing to an infantryman watching one approach his position. It weighed 7 tons, mounted a 37mm main gun and 2 7.7mm machine guns, and was crewed by 3 men who knew that against unarmored infantry they might as well have been driving invincible fortresses. The armor was thin enough that American medium tanks could penetrate it easily, but there were no American tanks at this roadblock. Only men with rifles and 1 soldier with a bazooka who was about to learn exactly what he was capable of when every alternative to action had been eliminated. The rest of the squad opened fire immediately, which was the correct tactical response and utterly futile at the same time. Rifle rounds sparked off the tank's armor plating like fireflies against steel, creating noise and light and absolutely no damage whatsoever. Machine gun fire was equally ineffective, the bullets fragmenting against the metal shells that protected the crews inside. The tanks did not slow down. They did not maneuver evasively. They simply continued forward at their grinding mechanical pace, their turrets beginning to traverse as the crews inside identified targets and prepared to demonstrate what high-explosive shells do to human bodies that have nowhere to hide. Dirk Vlug was the only man at that roadblock with a weapon that could actually stop what was coming. He was also, in that moment, completely alone in his role, because Bazooka doctrine required a 2-man team, and his loader was not there. Dead, wounded, separated, the specific reason dissolved into irrelevance against the simple fact that Vlug had 6 rockets and would have to load each one himself between shots, exposing himself completely each time, transforming a weapon designed for coordinated team operation into a solo performance that required him to act as both gunner and loader, while enemy tanks tried very hard to kill him. He stepped into the center of the road with the bazooka on his shoulder, and the first rocket already loaded, which meant he had managed that part while his brain was still processing the tactical situation. Muscle memory and training taking over before conscious thought could introduce the paralysis of fear. The lead tank was perhaps 50 yards away, close enough that Vlug could see the details of its construction, the way the armor plates were riveted together, the commander's hatch sealed against rifle fire, the main gun beginning to depress toward his position. 30 yards is the distance where you can smell the diesel exhaust. It is the distance where you stop thinking of a tank as a vehicle and start experiencing it as an entity, a thing with presence and weight and the clear intention to erase you from existence. It is also the distance where a bazooka rocket becomes less a ballistic proposition and more a point-and-shoot certainty if your hands are steady and your nerve holds. Vlug's nerve held. He aimed at the lead tank's frontal armor where the driver sat behind a vision slit, squeezed the trigger, and felt the launcher buck against his shoulder as the rocket motor ignited and sent 3.5 pounds of shaped explosive charge screaming across the shrinking distance between life and death. The rocket hit slightly left of center, and the shaped charge did exactly what it was designed to do, focusing the explosive force into a superheated jet of metal that punched through the Type 95's thin armor and turned the interior of the tank into a catastrophe of spalling metal fragments and concussive overpressure that killed the crew instantly. 1 down. 5 seconds elapsed. 4 tanks remaining and now fully aware that the man standing in the road represented a genuine threat to their continued existence. Their machine guns opened fire, tracers cutting through the air around Vlug's position, and he dropped flat to the ground, rolled to the side, came up already reaching for the second rocket because standing still was death and hesitation was death, and the only direction that led to survival was forward through the next shot, and the shot after that. Loading the bazooka alone required contortions that would have been comedic if they were not occurring under machine gun fire from 4 tanks that wanted him dead. He had to hold the launcher steady, grab a rocket from the bag, insert it into the rear of the tube, ensure the electrical contact was secure, and get back into firing position, all while moving, staying low, and not thinking too hard about the fact that he was performing a 2-man job in a 1-man time frame, while people were actively trying to kill him with automatic weapons. The second tank died the same way as the first, a rocket through the frontal armor that transformed it from a moving threat into a stationary wreck that began to burn with the peculiar acrid smell of diesel fuel and electrical components and things that should not be on fire combining into a smoke that would mark this stretch of road for hours after the shooting stopped. 2 down, 3 remaining. And now the tanks began to maneuver, their commanders realizing that the frontal approach was feeding them one at a time into the killing radius of a weapon they had not expected to encounter. They tried to spread out, to bring multiple guns to bear simultaneously, to create a tactical problem that no single soldier should have been able to solve. But the road was narrow. The jungle pressed close on both sides, and there was only so much room to maneuver before the terrain itself became the enemy. Vlug moved between shots, never firing from the same position twice, using every slight fold in the earth, every bit of vegetation, every moment when the tank's attention was divided to reload and reposition and line up the next shot. He had become a mechanism himself, a thing that processed threats in the order they presented themselves, and eliminated them with the methodical efficiency of a man who has stopped thinking about outcomes and focused entirely on the immediate task of making the weapon in his hands do the one thing it was designed to accomplish. The third tank tried to rush him, accelerating suddenly in an attempt to close the distance and either run him over or get close enough that the bazooka became useless. Vlug put a rocket into its turret ring, the weakest point where the rotating turret met the hull body, and the explosion jammed the traverse mechanism while simultaneously killing the gunner inside. The tank slewed to a halt, its crew bailing out through the hatches because a mobility-killed tank in close combat with enemy infantry was a metal coffin waiting to be sealed. 3 down, 2 remaining. And now Vlug did something that would later seem impossible to the men who heard the story secondhand. He holstered the bazooka, drew his M1911 pistol, and shot the Japanese tank crew members as they evacuated their destroyed vehicle. Not out of rage or bloodlust or any emotion that would have made the action comprehensible as a loss of control, but because they were still armed enemy combatants who represented a threat to his position, and shooting them was the tactically sound decision. The pistol cracked 7 times, the heavy .45 caliber rounds designed to stop a man in his tracks doing exactly that. And then Vlug was reloading the pistol with one hand, while reaching for another bazooka rocket with the other because 2 tanks were still operational, and his job was not finished. The 4th tank tried to back away, its commander finally understanding that proceeding forward meant death, and that retreat was the only rational option left. The driver threw the transmission into reverse, the treads churning mud and vegetation, as the Type 95 began its backward crawl, trying to put distance between itself and the American soldier who had become death incarnate on this stretch of road. But retreat in a tank is slower than advance, and visibility through the limited vision ports meant the driver was essentially steering blind, dependent on shouted directions from a commander whose primary concern had shifted from tactical aggression to simple survival. Vlug tracked the movement with the bazooka, waiting for the angle, waiting for the moment when the tank's rear armor would present itself in a configuration that maximized the rocket's penetrating power. The rear of any tank is its most vulnerable point, where armor is thinnest because designers assume the vehicle will be facing the enemy, and the weight budget demands compromises somewhere. The 4th tank's commander had made a choice between bad options and chosen the one that felt like it offered a path to survival. He was wrong. The rocket entered through the engine compartment's thin armor plating and detonated among the mechanical components that translated fuel into motion. Diesel tanks ruptured under the explosive force, lubricants ignited, electrical systems short-circuited in cascading failures that turned the engine block into shrapnel. The fire that followed was not the dramatic Hollywood explosion that audiences expect, but something worse, a creeping inferno that cooked metal and rubber and human flesh with methodical thoroughness. Smoke began pouring from every seam and hatch, black and oily, and carrying the smell of things burning that should never burn. 4 down, 1 remaining, and the final tank simply stopped in the middle of the road, its engine still running but its movement arrested by a calculus that had nothing to do with mechanical failure, and everything to do with the crew's sudden understanding that they were the last tank facing an enemy who had already proven capable of destroying 4 identical vehicles in rapid succession. The mathematics of their situation admitted no optimistic interpretation. They could advance and die like the first 3 tanks. They could retreat and die like the 4th. Or they could surrender and accept whatever fate American infantry chose to impose upon prisoners taken in combat, where their fellow tank crews now lay dead in burning wreckage. The hatch opened slowly, deliberately, the motion itself a form of communication that transcended language barriers. Hands emerged empty and raised, palms open to demonstrate the absence of weapons. Then the 3-man crew climbed out into the jungle air where American infantry could see them clearly and make their own decisions about what happened next. They stood on the hull of their tank, these 3 Japanese soldiers who had started the day believing they were about to participate in a victorious counterattack, and now found themselves surrendering to a force they could not even see properly, knowing only that somewhere in the smoke and chaos was an American soldier who had destroyed 5 tanks and lived to count the wreckage. 5 tanks destroyed, 6 rockets expended, Perhaps 3 minutes from the first shot to the last, though time in combat becomes a subjective experience that has little relationship to what clocks measure. Vlug stood on that road surrounded by burning wreckage and the bodies of men who had been alive when the sun rose that morning. And when his squad mates arrived moments later, they found him calmly reloading his pistol, as if he had just completed a training exercise, rather than performed an action that would become the stuff of regimental legend. The physical reality of what he had done lay scattered across 50 yards of jungle road, in a tableau that seemed impossible even to the men who witnessed the aftermath directly. 5 Type 95 tanks, each weighing 7 tons, reduced to smoking ruins by a weapon that weighed 13 pounds, and a man who weighed perhaps 160. The air stank of burning diesel fuel, scorched metal, explosive residue, and the particular smell of human bodies exposed to fire and high-velocity metal fragments. Smoke rose in black columns that would be visible for miles, a signal to both American and Japanese forces that something significant had occurred on this otherwise unremarkable stretch of road. Vlug's hands were steady as he reloaded the pistol, muscle memory executing the familiar sequence of dropping the empty magazine, retrieving a full one from his belt, seating it with a sharp upward motion, and chambering around with the slide. His breathing was elevated but controlled, the physical aftermath of adrenaline beginning to ebb from his system now that the immediate threat had been neutralized. He did not shake. He did not collapse. He did not display any of the dramatic emotional responses that would have been completely understandable given what he had just survived. He simply stood there, weapon ready, eyes scanning the jungle for additional threats, because the tactical situation was not necessarily resolved just because the tanks had been stopped. His squad mates approached with the cautious respect men show when they encounter something that exceeds their understanding of what is possible. They had heard the explosions, had seen the smoke, had understood that Vlug was engaging the tanks, but witnessing the aftermath was different from imagining it. 5 tanks, 1 man. The equation should not have worked. Military doctrine, tactical logic, and simple probability all said that what they were looking at should not exist. And yet there it was, undeniable and smoking in the humid Philippine air. The tactical consequences were immediate and significant. The destruction of the tank column halted a Japanese counterattack that had been intended to retake the road and disrupt the American supply lines. The wreckage blocked the route for hours, buying time for reinforcements to arrive and consolidate the position. The psychological impact on nearby Japanese units who learned that 5 tanks had been destroyed by a single American soldier created a hesitation, a momentary doubt about the vulnerability of their armor that rippled through the tactical decision-making of local commanders. Wars are not won by single actions, but they are shaped by moments when the expected outcome fails to materialize, and one side is forced to recalculate what they thought they knew about the enemy's capabilities. The Medal of Honor citation would come later, after the reports had been filed and witnesses interviewed, and the chain of command had verified that yes, this actually happened. One soldier with a bazooka designed for team operation had indeed destroyed 5 tanks while under fire, and prevented a breakthrough that could have changed the local tactical situation significantly. The citation is a dry document, as such things tend to be, listing facts and actions in language designed to be official and permanent. It does not capture what it feels like to stand alone against impossible odds. It does not describe the specific quality of fear that comes with knowing you are about to do something that will probably kill you. It cannot convey the moment when training and instinct and desperate necessity combine to create an action that exceeds what any reasonable person would have predicted. Dirk Vlug survived the war. This fact is worth stating explicitly because so many men who performed similar acts of extraordinary courage did not. He came home to Michigan, returned to a civilian life that must have seemed impossibly ordinary after what he had experienced, and took a job as a mail carrier. He walked the same routes day after day, delivering letters and packages to people who knew him as a quiet man who did his job reliably and did not talk much about himself. Some of his neighbors knew he had been in the war. Fewer knew he had received the Medal of Honor. Almost none knew the specific details of what he had done on a jungle road on Leyte Island on December 15, 1944. He married, he raised a family. He lived a life defined by normalcy and routine, and the small satisfactions of work done well and responsibilities met. When people asked him about the war, his responses were brief and deflecting, the standard replies of veterans who have learned that the people asking the questions rarely want the real answers. The story of the 5 tanks became something that existed in official records and regimental histories, and the memories of the few men who had been there. But it was not something Dirk Vlug felt the need to discuss over dinner or mention at social gatherings. There is a particular kind of heroism that refuses to understand itself as heroic. It is the heroism of men who did what they did because the situation required it, and there was no one else to do it, and thinking too hard about the alternatives would have made action impossible. Dirk Vlug never spoke of his actions on Leyte as heroic. In the few interviews he gave late in his life, his descriptions were factual and understated, focused on the mechanical details of loading and firing the bazooka rather than the existential terror of standing alone against 5 tanks. He had been trained to use the weapon. The situation required the weapon to be used. He used it. The fact that this simple sequence of events required him to risk his life repeatedly over the span of a few minutes was, in his telling, almost incidental to the primary task. But heroism is not defined by how the hero understands his own actions. It is defined by the moment when an ordinary person is confronted with a choice between self-preservation and a duty that transcends self-interest, and chooses duty even when that choice carries the near certainty of death. Vlug had that choice on the Ormoc Road. He could have retreated, could have let the tanks pass, could have prioritized his own survival over the tactical objective of holding the roadblock. Every instinct for self-preservation would have justified that choice. No one would have blamed him. His death would have been noted in a casualty report and forgotten by everyone except his family and the few friends who knew him personally. He chose differently. He chose to step into the center of that road with a weapon he would have to operate alone, knowing that the mathematics of the situation were brutally clear. 6 rockets, 5 tanks, and if every shot did not count, if one rocket malfunctioned or missed or failed to penetrate, the tanks would reach his position, and that would be the end of Dirk Vlug's war and Dirk Vlug's life. He made that choice not once but 6 times in the space of 3 minutes, each reload a renewed commitment to the same impossible proposition, each shot a defiance of the overwhelming force arrayed against him. The men he saved, by destroying those tanks, never knew his name. They were soldiers somewhere else in the American line who did not die in a Japanese breakthrough, because that breakthrough never happened. They were wounded men being evacuated down a road that remained in American hands because 5 tanks had been stopped before they could advance. They were supply trucks that made it through with ammunition and medical supplies because the route stayed open. Heroism often works this way, creating effects that ripple outward in ways that can never be fully traced, saving lives that will never know they were in danger, changing outcomes that exist only as probabilities prevented. Dirk Vlug died in 1993 at the age of 69, having lived nearly 5 decades beyond that December day on Leyte. His obituary mentioned his military service and his Medal of Honor. It mentioned his work as a mail carrier, his family, the community organizations he had quietly supported. It did not mention that he had once stood alone against 5 tanks and won, not because the information was secret, but because to those who knew him, that action was something he had done once a long time ago, not who he was in the daily reality of his life. But history remembers what individuals choose to forget. The action on the Ormoc Road became part of the official record of the Leyte campaign, a footnote in the larger story of how American forces wrested control of the Philippines from Japanese hands at terrible cost. Military historians studying the campaign note Vlug's action as an example of individual initiative in combat, a case study in what can happen when training, equipment, and desperate necessity combine in a single moment. The story gets told in schools where future soldiers learn about the capabilities of infantry anti-tank weapons. It appears in documentaries about the Pacific War, another example of the extraordinary courage that ordinary men displayed when circumstances demanded it. And that, perhaps, is the point. Dirk Vlug was an ordinary man. There was nothing in his background or personality that predicted he would do something extraordinary. He was not a professional warrior who had spent his life preparing for combat. He was not a man who sought glory or craved recognition. He was a farm kid from Michigan who got drafted, learned to use a bazooka, and found himself in a situation where using that bazooka was the only thing standing between a Japanese tank column and an American roadblock that had to hold. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is not superhuman strength or invulnerability to normal human emotions. Courage is the decision to act when action is required, despite the fear, despite the odds, despite the voice in your head that is screaming at you to run and save yourself and let someone else solve this problem. Courage is stepping into the center of the road with 5 tanks coming toward you and deciding that your job is to stop those tanks, and then doing that job even when every survival instinct you possess is telling you that what you are about to attempt is suicide. The world is full of moments when ordinary people make extraordinary choices. Most of those moments go unrecorded, unwitnessed, forgotten as soon as they pass. A few get noticed, written up in citations, turned into stories that get told and retold until they become legends. Dirk Vlug's moment was noticed. His action was witnessed, recorded, recognized with the highest military decoration his country could award. But the real story is not about the medal or the official recognition. The real story is about what happens inside a human being when the universe presents an impossible choice, and that person decides to attempt the impossible anyway. On a jungle road on Leyte Island on December 15, 1944, one man with 6 rockets faced 5 tanks and won. Not because he was superhuman, but because he was human in the most essential sense, capable of choosing duty over survival, courage over fear, action over paralysis. That choice, made in the span of a few desperate minutes, changed the tactical situation on one small section of one road, in one campaign of one theater of the largest war in human history. It also revealed something fundamental about what people can do when everything depends on them doing it. Dirk Vlug went home after the war and carried mail for 40 years, and if you had asked him about that day on Leyte, he probably would have changed the subject. But the story remains, preserved in official records and fading memories, and the occasional retelling by people who understand that some actions transcend the moment in which they occur and become something larger, something that speaks to the possibility of human courage in the face of impossible odds. 5 tanks, 6 rockets. One man who refused to quit when quitting was the only rational option. That is the story. That is what happened on the Ormoc Road in the Philippines in December of 1944, when Private First Class Dirk J. Vlug did the impossible because it needed to be done, and there was no one else to do it. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to this channel for more forgotten stories of extraordinary courage from history's bloodiest conflicts. Leave a like if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered and shared. And here is a question worth considering as you go about your day. If you were standing on that road, watching those tanks approach, knowing what Dirk Vlug knew about his chances of survival, what choice would you make? Would you run or would you fight? Think about that. Really think about it. Because the answer you give yourself when your life is not on the line might be very different from the choice you would actually make when everything depends on it. What kind of person do you hope you would be in that moment? What kind of person do you fear you might actually be? Those are the questions that matter, because courage is not tested until the moment when the test becomes real.